The humidity of the morning still clung to Ava's skin like a damp veil as she stood before the towering glass monolith of Sterling and Associates. To anyone else, it was just a building, a sleek 60-story needle piercing the smoggy London skyline. To Ava, it was a fortress, and she was an intruder at the gates. She adjusted the lapels of her navy blazer. It was polyester, second-hand, and slightly too large in the shoulders, smelling faintly of the lavender detergent her mother used back at the park. She could still feel the grit of the gravel driveway under her heels from when she'd walked to the bus stop at 4:30 a.m. Her hands, hidden in her pockets, were a map of her life. Small scars from helping her father with the rusted underside of their trailer, and calluses from years of gripping heavy textbooks until the sun rose over the pines. She stepped through the revolving doors. The air inside didn't just feel cooler, it felt expensive. It smelled of filtered oxygen, polished mahogany, and the kind of quiet that only comes when everyone in a room knows exactly how much they are worth. "Name?" the receptionist asked, not looking up from a screen that glowed with a soft, ethereal blue. Ava Thorne. I'm here for the summer associate orientation." The receptionist paused, her gaze flickering to Ava's shoes. They were scuffed at the toe despite the frantic polishing Ava had done with a piece of old felt. For a heartbeat, the silence was a physical weight. "Floor 54, the woman said, sliding a plastic badge across the marble counter. "Don't lose it. It costs more to replace than your first week's stipend." As Ava ascended in the elevator, the pressure in her ears mimicked the mounting tightness in her chest. She wasn't just representing herself. She was representing the girl who had studied by the light of a camping lantern when the power got cut. The girl who had memorized the civil code while working the register at a roadside diner. The doors slid open to a lounge that felt more like a cathedral. Huge windows offered a panoramic view of the city, but the people inside were looking at each other, not the horizon. That was when she saw him. Theodore Sterling didn't walk into a room. He occupied it. He was leaning against a floor-to-ceiling window, a crystal glass of sparkling water in his hand, surrounded by 3 other young men who looked like they'd been manufactured in the same high-end factory. His suit was a charcoal silk-wool blend that draped perfectly over his broad shoulders, his hair swept back with the kind of effortless precision that only a $100 haircut can provide. He was beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful, sharp, cold, and devastatingly certain of its own power. "And then my father says, 'Theodore, if you can't win the mock trial, don't bother coming home for the Hamptons weekend,'" and he was saying, his voice a rich, cultivated baritone. The others laughed. It was a practiced, sycophantic sound. Theodore's eyes, a piercing, icy gray, swept across the room. They landed on Ava. He didn't look away. Most people looked away when they realized they were staring at someone who didn't belong. Theodore did the opposite. He narrowed his eyes, his gaze traveling from her ill-fitting blazer down to her thrifted heels and back up to her face. He didn't smile. He looked at her the way a curator might look at a smudge on an otherwise perfect painting. "Well," Theodore murmured, loud enough for his circle to hear. "It seems the firm has finally met its diversity quota for the year. I didn't realize the local community college had a law program." Ava felt the heat crawl up her neck, a hot, stinging crimson. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She should have looked down. She should have moved toward the coffee station and vanished into the crowd. Instead, she straightened her spine. "Oxford, actually," Ava said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her hands. "On a full academic scholarship. And you must be Theodore. I recognize the name from the lobby, the one your father paid for." The circle of boys went silent. The air in the room seemed to thin. Theodore straightened, pushing off the window. He took a step toward her, closing the distance until she could smell the subtle, expensive scent of sandalwood and bergamot on his skin. He was a head taller than her, forcing her to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "Scholarship," he repeated, the word sounding like an insult in his mouth. "So, you're the charity case. Tell me, Ava, is that right? Did they give you the suit as part of the package, or did you have to win a bake sale for it?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned his back on her, the movement fluid and dismissive, and walked toward the conference room. His friends followed, one of them glancing back at her with a smirk that felt like a slap. Ava stood alone in the center of the marble floor. She could feel the eyes of the other interns, the children of judges, the heirs to fortunes, skating over her. She took a deep breath, the sterile, recycled air burning her lungs. She reached into her bag and felt the corner of her worn copy of Black's Law Dictionary. It was her armor. The first 4 hours were a blur of NDAs, billable hour tutorials, and the crushing realization of the hierarchy. At Sterling and Associates, there were the gods, the partners, the disciples, the associates, and the ghosts, the interns. By noon, Ava's head was thumping. She found a small break room tucked away behind the library, a cramped space with a humming refrigerator and a single laminate table. It was empty. She sat down, her body finally sagging, and pulled a plastic container from her bag. Inside was a sandwich. White bread, thin slices of ham, and a single leaf of wilting lettuce. It was what she could afford after paying her bus fare and her mother's medication for the month. She ate slowly, trying to focus on the case files she'd been handed, her mind dissecting the complexities of a corporate merger. The door swung open. Theodore walked in, followed by a girl named Sophia, whose jewelry probably cost more than Ava's trailer. They stopped short when they saw her. "Oh," Sophia said, wrinkling her nose. "Is someone eating in here? The smell is a bit much." Theodore looked at the table. He looked at the plastic container, the cheap white bread, and the way Ava was holding her crusts. A slow, mocking smile spread across his face, the first time he had smiled since she'd met him. It wasn't a warm expression. It was the look of a predator finding a weakness. "Look at that, Sophia," Theodore said, his voice dripping with mock wonder. "The scholarship girl is having a feast. What is that? Processed ham? I haven't seen that since the last time I visited a soup kitchen for my college admissions essay." "Theodore, stop," Sophia giggled, though she didn't look away. Theodore walked over to the table, leaning his hands on the laminate surface, invading Ava's space. "Do you even know what real food tastes like, Ava? Or does the scholarship only cover the bottom shelf of the grocery store?" Ava didn't stop chewing. She swallowed, her throat dry, and looked him dead in the eye. "It tastes like something I earned, Theodore. I wouldn't expect you to understand the concept." Theodore's jaw tightened. The playfulness vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, sharp flash of genuine anger. He reached out, his long, manicured fingers flicking the edge of her plastic container. It skittered across the table, some of the crumbs falling onto her lap. "You're here to fetch coffee and check citations," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't mistake a lucky break for equality. You're a ghost in this building, and ghosts are easily replaced." He turned to leave, but as he reached the door, he stopped. He looked back at her, his gaze lingering on the way she didn't flinch, the way she sat there in her oversized blazer with her head held high. For a split second, the mockery in his expression flickered, a moment of confusion, a hesitation as if he were seeing a glitch in his world. Then, he was gone, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. Ava sat in the silence, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. She looked down at the crumbs on her lap. Her hands were shaking. Not from sadness, she was long past crying over boys like Theodore Sterling, but from a cold, simmering resolve. 2 hours later, the interns were gathered in the main boardroom for a preliminary briefing on the Vance versus Thorne case, a massive real estate dispute that the firm was handling. The room was a temple of glass and steel. At the head of the table sat Marcus Sterling, Theodore's father. He was an older, harder version of his son, with eyes that looked like they could calculate the cost of a soul in seconds. "The problem," Marcus said, his voice a gravelly rasp, "is the easement clause in the 1974 deed. It's a dead end. Our client wants to build, but the local council has them pinned. I want to hear thoughts, and don't give me the textbook answer." The room went silent. Sophia shifted in her seat. Theodore leaned back, looking bored, though Ava noticed the way he watched his father, his posture rigid. "We could argue eminent domain," one intern suggested tentatively. "Old, tired, Next, Marcus snapped. Theodore cleared his throat. The 1974 deed was signed under duress, Father. We could challenge the validity of the original signature based on the notary's records from that period. Marcus narrowed his eyes. A long shot. It would take months of discovery we don't have. Anyone else? Or am I paying for a room full of expensive wallpaper? Ava felt the familiar electric pull in her brain. She had read the case file over her ham sandwich. She had seen something. A tiny overlooked footnote about the water table and the local agricultural zoning laws from the 19th century. She cleared her throat. It was a small sound, but in the tense silence, it echoed. The 1974 deed is irrelevant, Ava said. Theodore turned his head so fast he almost spilled his water. The other intern stared at her as if she'd just spoken in tongues. Marcus Sterling looked at her, his eyebrows arching. Go on, scholarship. Ava didn't look at Theodore. She looked at Marcus. The easement clause relies on the land being classified as industrial adjacent. But in 1892, this specific plot was granted a perpetual agricultural exemption for the local parish. Under the Land Act of 1925, that exemption wasn't dissolved. It was grandfathered in. The 1974 deed attempted to overwrite a sovereign land grant. It's legally void. You don't need to fight the easement. You just need to prove the deed itself never had the authority to exist. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of judgment, it was the silence of a vacuum. Marcus Sterling leaned forward, his eyes boring into Ava's. He didn't say a word for 10 long seconds. Then he looked at his son. Theodore, Marcus said quietly, did you catch that footnote? Theodore looked at the table. His face was pale. His jaw set so hard a muscle in his cheek was twitching. No, Father. Read the 1892 grants, Marcus commanded, looking back at Ava. All of you. And someone get Miss Thorne a proper chair. She seems to be the only one in the room who actually knows how to read. As the meeting broke up, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The interns were whispering, casting sideways glances at Ava. She felt a brief, fluttering sense of triumph, but it was quickly dampened by the weight of a gaze. Theodore was standing by the door. He wasn't mocking her anymore. He was staring at her with a look that was almost predatory, yet laced with something else. Something that looked dangerously like recognition. He didn't speak as she passed him. But as her shoulder brushed his, she felt the static between them, a cold, sharp energy that made the hair on her arms stand up. She had won the battle, but she knew as she caught the shadow of his silhouette against the glass that the war had only just begun. And in this building, the house always won. Ava walked back to her desk, the scuff on her shoe forgotten, her mind already moving to the next case. She didn't see Theodore watching her from the end of the hall, his hand gripping the strap of his leather briefcase so tightly his knuckles were white. The chasm between them was still there, vast, deep, and filled with 1,000 years of history. But for the first time, a bridge of pure, cold intellect had been thrown across the dark. As the sun began to set, casting long orange shadows across the office, Ava found herself back in the library, the smell of old paper and leather binding grounding her. She was reaching for a heavy volume of land statutes when a hand reached over her head and pulled it down first. She spun around. Theodore was standing there holding the book. The evening light caught the gray of his eyes, making them look like polished flint. He didn't hand her the book. He held it against his chest, his expression unreadable. That was a lucky catch, he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to vibrate in the quiet space between the shelves. It wasn't luck, Ava replied, her heart starting that annoying, frantic beat again. It was work. Something you might want to try sometime. Theodore leaned in, his face inches from hers. The shadow of his stubble was visible now, a stark contrast to his perfect suit. You think you're so different from us, don't you? With your scholarships and your ham sandwiches. I know I am, she whispered. He looked down at her lips, then back up to her eyes. The tension was so thick it felt like something she could reach out and touch. For a moment his gaze softened, a tiny, microscopic fracture in the ice. You're right, he said, his voice barely audible. You are different. But in this city, different usually gets broken. He shoved the book into her hands and walked away, leaving her standing in the darkening library, the weight of the law heavy in her arms, and the scent of his cologne lingering in the air like a promise or a threat. The first day was over. The lines were drawn, and as Ava looked out at the city lights, she knew that she wouldn't just survive Sterling and Associates. She would change it, or it would change her. The rain began as a rhythmic tapping against the reinforced glass of the 54th floor, a dull staccato that seemed to mock the frantic silence inside the office. It was 3 days after the board meeting, and the atmosphere in the intern pool had shifted from competitive to predatory. Ava felt the weight of a dozen gazes every time she walked to the printer. She was no longer just the scholarship girl, she was a threat. But Marcus Sterling didn't reward talent with comfort. He rewarded it with more weight. The Vance merger is hemorrhaging time, Marcus had barked that morning, leaning over the glass table in his office. He hadn't looked at Theodore. He had looked directly at Ava. The due diligence on the subsidiary holdings is a mess. Theodore, you'll lead the review. Thorne, you're his shadow. I want a full report on my desk by Monday morning. If you sleep, sleep on the commute. Now tucked away in a windowless war room on the basement level, a space usually reserved for document shredding and long-forgotten archives, the friction between them was palpable. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, ozone from a struggling photocopier, and the sharp, intrusive notes of Theodore's bergamot cologne. Theodore sat across from her, his tie loosened for the first time since she'd met him. He had stripped off his blazer, revealing a crisp white shirt with cufflinks that caught the fluorescent light every time he turned a page. He wasn't working. He was brooding, his pen tapping a restless, aggressive beat against a leather-bound folder. "This is beneath me," Theodore muttered, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. Sorting through 30 years of property tax receipts because some clerk in the 90s didn't know how to file a lien. Ava didn't look up from her stack. She was wearing a sweater she'd knitted herself, the wool a bit scratchy against her neck. "It's not beneath the client, and it's not beneath the firm. Don't lecture me on the firm, Ava. I've been walking these halls since I was in diapers." "Maybe that's the problem," she said quietly, her pen flying across a yellow legal pad. "You think the building belongs to you. You forgot that the law belongs to everyone." Theodore slammed his folder shut. The sound was like a gunshot in the small room. He leaned across the table, his shadow falling over her work. "You think you're so righteous. You think because you lived in a trailer and studied by a flashlight that you have some moral high ground. But look at you. You're sitting in a basement exhausted, working for a man who won't even remember your name by Christmas. Is this the dream, Ava? Being a better servant than the rest of us?" Ava finally looked up. Her eyes were rimmed with red from lack of sleep, but the fire in them was cold and steady. "The difference is, Theodore, if I lose this job, I lose my future. If you lose this job, you just move into a different office with a better view. I don't have the luxury of being bored." She reached for her bag and pulled out her lunch. The plastic container made a dull thud on the table. Today it was a simple pasta salad. No meat, mostly just noodles and oil. Theodore stared at the container. He didn't mock her this time. He just watched as she took a small, disciplined bite, her eyes already drifting back to the documents. He saw the way her fingers, thin and nimble, trembled slightly from the 5th cup of bad office coffee. He saw the small silver locket around her neck, a cheap piece of jewelry that she touched whenever she felt overwhelmed. For the first time, the mockery failed him. He felt a strange, uncomfortable knot in his stomach. Not pity, but a confusing sense of recognition. He knew what it was like to be under his father's thumb, to feel the suffocating pressure of an expectation he could never quite meet. But he had never known what it was to be hungry. "The coffee upstairs is better," he said abruptly. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest he could get. "I don't have time to go upstairs," Ava replied without looking at him. Theodore stood up, his chair scraping loudly. He walked out of the room without another word. Ava sighed, leaning her head in her hands for a brief moment. The silence of the basement felt heavier now that he was gone. She felt the isolation of her position, the ghost in the machine, working twice as hard to get half as far. 10 minutes later, the door swung open. Theodore walked back in, carrying 2 large cups from the artisanal cafe across the street. He set one down in front of her. It wasn't black office sludge. It was a latte with a perfect foam heart on top. "I didn't ask for this," Ava said, staring at the cup. "Just drink it, Thorne. You're starting to look like a Victorian orphan, and it's distracting." He sat back down and reopened his folder, his face a mask of indifference. Ava hesitated, then took a sip. It was warm, rich, and tasted like a world she had never been invited to. "Thank you," she whispered. Theodore didn't acknowledge it. They worked in a fragile, temporary truce for the next 4 hours. The only sounds were the turning of pages and the hum of the AC. But the air had changed. The static between them was no longer just anger. It was a heightened awareness. Every time their hands brushed while reaching for a shared file, a physical jolt went through Ava's system. She could smell the rain on his skin, the heat radiating from him in the cramped space. Around 2 a.m., Ava froze. She was looking at a collateralized debt obligation from 2018, signed by Marcus Sterling himself. Her eyes narrowed. She flipped back through the previous folders, her heart beginning to race. "Theodore," she said, her voice strained. "What now? Did you find a typo in the footer? Look at the dates on the signature page of the Sterling Vance agreement. Then look at the filing date for the corporate shield." Theodore frowned, leaning over her shoulder. His chest was inches from her back, his breath warm against her ear. He took the documents from her, his eyes scanning the lines with the practiced ease of someone who had been raised on contracts. His face went ashen. This isn't possible," he whispered. "Your father signed the personal guarantee before the corporate shield was legally enacted," Ava said, her voice low. "If this merger goes through and the Vance holdings are audited, the shield is pierced. Your family isn't just liable for the firm's debt. They're personally liable for the entire Vance deficit. Everything, the estate, the accounts, the firm itself. It's a total collapse." Theodore sank back into his chair, the document fluttering to the floor. He looked at the concrete wall as if he could see through it to the empire his father had built. He was in a rush. He wanted to close before the fiscal year. He thought he was untouchable. He looked at Ava, and for the first time she saw fear in his eyes. Not the fear of a spoiled boy losing his toys, but the fear of a man realizing his father was a god with clay feet. "If you put this in the report," Theodore said, his voice cracking, "it's over. He'll be ruined. My mother, she wouldn't survive the scandal." Ava looked at the document on the floor. This was it. This was her leverage. She could take this to the senior partners, prove Marcus Sterling's negligence, and secure a permanent associate position before the summer was even over. She could climb the ladder over the broken pieces of the Sterling name. She looked at Theodore. He was waiting for the blow. He expected her to gloat. He expected the scholarship girl to finally take her revenge. Instead, Ava reached down and picked up the paper. She didn't put it in the report pile. She pulled out a fresh legal pad and started writing. "What are you doing?" Theodore asked. "There's a 90-day ratification window in the bylaws of the subsidiary," she said, her pen moving with frantic precision. "If we file a retroactive amendment under the clerical error provision before Monday morning, we can bridge the gap. It'll be a nightmare of paperwork, and we'll have to forge a trail of internal memos to justify the delay, but it's legal. Barely." Theodore stared at her. "Why?" Ava stopped writing. She looked at him, and for the first time the gap between the trailer park and the penthouse disappeared. "Because my father spent 20 years under the hood of cars, breathing in exhaust so I could go to school. He taught me that a person's name is the only thing they truly own. I'm not in the business of stealing legacies, Theodore. I'm in the business of the law." Theodore didn't move. He sat there, illuminated by the harsh light, looking at the girl he had mocked, the girl he had called a charity case, He saw her exhaustion, her integrity, and the sheer unyielding brilliance of her mind. "I've spent my whole life trying to be a Sterling," Theodore said softly, his voice thick with a sudden raw emotion. "And you've spent yours just being Ava. I think you're the one who's actually wealthy." He reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers. He didn't touch her, not yet, but the space between them was humming with a new, dangerous frequency. "Let's fix it," he said. "Show me what to do." They worked through the dawn. They didn't speak of class or money or sandwiches. They spoke of clauses and amendments and the delicate art of legal architecture. Theodore followed her lead, his arrogance stripped away, replaced by a desperate, focused hunger to be worthy of the space she had given him. When the sun finally rose, casting a pale gray light through the high, dirty vents of the basement, the documents were ready. Theodore stood up, his eyes lingering on Ava as she packed her bag. She looked smaller than she had the night before, more fragile, yet somehow more monumental. "Ava," he said as she reached the door. She turned. I'm sorry," he said. The words were clumsy, unpracticed, but they were real. "About the things I said, about everything." Ava looked at him for a long moment. She didn't offer a smile. She didn't offer forgiveness. "Don't be sorry, Theodore. Be better. That's the only apology that matters in this building." She walked out, the heavy door thudding shut. Theodore stood alone in the basement, the scent of lavender and wood smoke, the scent of her, clinging to the air. He looked at the latte cup she'd left behind, the foam heart now collapsed and cold. He knew as he headed upstairs to face his father that he would never look at the Sterling name the same way again. And he would never, for as long as he lived, be able to look at Ava Thorne as just a scholarship girl. She was the person who had saved his world, and she was the only person he had ever met who didn't want a single thing from him in return. If this story is captivating you, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It really helps us bring you more stories like this. The morning light that Monday didn't feel like a victory, it felt like an interrogation. Ava and Theodore stood side by side in Marcus Sterling's office, their eyes bloodshot, their clothes rumpled from 48 hours of frantic legal surgery. On the mahogany desk lay the ratified amendment, the clerical error that bridged the gap and saved the Sterling personal fortune from the Vance deficit. Marcus didn't offer them a seat. He didn't offer a thank you. He picked up the document, scanned the signatures, and a slow, predatory smile touched his lips. "Ingenious," Marcus murmured. He looked at Ava, his eyes cold and calculating. "You have a certain flexibility, Miss Thorne. Most scholars are too rigid for this kind of work. You understand that the law is a suggestion, not a fence." "It's a bridge, sir," Ava replied, her voice flat. "I didn't do it to break the rules. I did it because the rules allowed for a correction." Theodore stepped forward, his voice filled with a desperate hope. "We fixed it, Father. The exposure is gone. The merger can proceed." Marcus let out a short, dry bark of a laugh. He looked at his son with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Theodore, you always did focus on the wrong details. You saved the porch while the foundation was already on fire. The door to the office didn't open. It was breached." The sound of heavy boots on marble echoed from the lobby, a rhythmic, industrial thud that silenced the hum of the office. Ava turned to see a phalanx of men in dark windbreakers with FBI stenciled in stark white across the back. The glass-walled sanctuary of Sterling and Associates was suddenly filled with the cold blue light of sirens reflecting off the skyline. "Marcus Sterling?" a lead agent asked, stepping into the room. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and grand larceny in relation to the Sterling Vance holdings." The silence that followed was absolute. Ava felt the floor tilt beneath her. The clerical error she had stayed up all night to fix wasn't the problem. It was a drop of water in an ocean of corruption. Marcus didn't flinch as they clicked the handcuffs around his wrists. He looked at Theodore, not with apology, but with a final, chilling assessment. "The firm is dead, Theodore," Marcus said as they led him away. "I hope you kept the receipt for that suit." The collapse happened in real time. Within hours, the servers were seized. The ghosts and the disciples were ushered out of the building by security guards who looked bored by the tragedy. Ava stood on the sidewalk, her oversized navy blazer draped over her arm, her cheap plastic container of pasta salad still in her bag, a lunch she would never eat. She saw Theodore leaning against a lamppost. The charcoal silk wool suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His family's assets were frozen. The sterling name, which had been his only currency, was now a brand of shame. Ava walked toward him. The rain began to fall, a light, cold drizzle that smelled of wet asphalt and lost dreams. "Theodore," she said softly. He didn't look at her. He was staring at the revolving doors of the building that used to bear his name. "You were right, Ava. Different usually gets broken. But I didn't realize that same gets incinerated." He finally looked at her, and the gray of his eyes was flat, like unpolished lead. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them, the same unfinished gesture from the basement. For a heartbeat, Ava thought he might touch her cheek, might bridge the chasm for good. But his hand dropped. He pulled his fingers into a fist. "Go," he whispered. "The recruiters are already circling. You're the only one who didn't get stained by this. If you stay near me, you'll smell like the smoke." "I told you to be better, Theodore," Ava said, her voice trembling with a sudden, sharp grief she didn't want to feel. "I didn't tell you to disappear." "I don't have a choice," he said, turning away. "I don't even have a name anymore." He walked into the rain, his shoulders slumped, vanishing into the crowd of commuters who didn't know or care that a prince had just become a pauper. Ava stood there until the lavender scent on her skin was washed away by the storm, her hand gripping her locket, her mind already calculating the only thing she had left: the work. The 5-year grind time didn't move in months or years for Ava. It moved in billable hours and library stacks. The montage of her life was a blur of cold coffee and fluorescent lights. While the scandal of Marcus Sterling faded from the front pages, Ava Thorne became a legend in the corridors of the London legal scene. She finished Oxford at the top of her class, her graduation photo showing a woman with a sharper jawline and eyes that had seen the bottom of the world. She didn't buy a car. She didn't buy a house. She moved her parents out of the trailer park and into a quiet cottage in the countryside, paying for it with the bonuses she earned by being the first one in the office and the last one to leave. She became the Iron Scholar at Blackwood and Finch. She wore tailored suits now, high-end wool that didn't itch, and her scuffed heels were replaced by Italian leather that clicked with authority on the marble floors. But in the top drawer of her desk, tucked behind her fountain pens, sat a faded copy of a 1925 Land Act and a small, empty plastic container. They were her anchors. Meanwhile, the world had been less kind to the boy who lost his name. Theodore Sterling spent the first year in a stupor of shame. He watched from a cramped one-bedroom apartment as his mother's jewelry was auctioned off to pay for his father's legal defense. When the money ran out, the friends vanished. The girls who had giggled at his jokes wouldn't return his texts. He learned the weight of $1 not in a boardroom, but at a construction site. His hands, once manicured and soft, became a map of labor. He worked the day shift hauling drywall and the night shift as a security guard, reading law books by the light of a flickering monitor. Every time he felt his spirit break, he remembered a girl in an oversized blazer telling him that a name is the only thing a person truly owns. He stopped trying to be a Sterling. He started trying to be a man. The present day. 5 years to the day after the collapse, Ava Thorne stood in her corner office at Blackwood and Finch. The view was better than the one at Sterling's, higher, clearer, looking out over the Thames. She was 27, a junior partner, and the youngest woman to ever hold the title in the firm's history. Her assistant, a nervous young man named Riley, tapped on the door. "Miss Thorne? The candidates for the junior associate position are here for the final round of interviews." Ava didn't look up from the brief she was reviewing. "Send the first one in. And Riley, if they haven't read the 2024 revisions to the tax code, don't bother bringing me their resume." "Actually, Miss Thorne, there's one candidate. His credentials are unusual. He finished his degree at a night school while working full-time in construction. His grades are perfect, but his history... Ava paused, her pen hovering over the paper. A strange, cold prickle climbed the back of her neck. What's his name? Theodore. Just Theodore, he says. He legally dropped his surname 3 years ago. The silence in the office became a vacuum. Ava felt the air thin, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. She looked at the window, her reflection ghosted against the clouds. "Send him in," she said, her voice a whisper that sounded like a command. The door opened. He didn't walk in like a storm this time. He walked in like a man who knew the exact cost of the floor he was stepping on. Theodore was leaner, his face stripped of the soft arrogance of youth. His skin was tanned from the sun, his hands showing the faint white scars of manual labor. He wore a suit that was clean and well pressed, but clearly off the rack, the kind of suit a man buys when he has saved for 6 months to afford it. He stopped in the center of the room. The scent of sandalwood and bergamot was gone, replaced by the faint, clean smell of soap and something that reminded Ava of the outdoors, of cedar and sweat and reality. Ava slowly turned her chair around. Theodore froze. His breath hitched, a small, involuntary sound that broke the professional silence of the room. He looked at the woman behind the desk, the sharp, stunning, powerful woman who bore the face of the girl he had once mocked in a basement. "Ava," he breathed. "It's Partner Thorne," she said, her voice like silk over steel. She picked up his resume, her eyes skating over the list of night school credits and the 4 years of labor. She looked at the scholarship section at the bottom. She looked up at him, her gaze boring into his. "You're late for your interview, Theodore, and I believe you're overqualified for a junior position. Why are you here?" Theodore took a breath, his shoulders squaring. He didn't look away. The gray of his eyes was no longer cold. It was forged. "I'm here because 5 years ago a girl told me to be better," he said, his voice steady. "It took me a long time to learn what that meant. I'm not here for a job, Ava. I'm here to show you that I finally own my name, even if it isn't the one I started with." The tension in the room was a living thing. A bridge of pure, unadulterated history stretched across the 5-year gap. Ava looked at the man who had been her tormentor, her partner, and her ghost. She saw the work. She saw the hunger. And for the first time in 5 years, she felt the locket around her neck grow warm. "Sit down, Theodore," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Let's see if you can handle the work." The silence in Ava's office didn't just hang. It hummed with the ghosts of 1,000 unsaid things. Theodore sat in the guest chair, the same chair where she had seen captains of industry tremble before her billable hours. He sat with his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. They were laborers' hands, the skin thickened and the knuckles slightly enlarged. A far cry from the manicured fingers that had once flicked breadcrumbs at her in a basement break room. Ava didn't offer him water. She didn't offer a smile. She looked at his resume as if it were a piece of evidence in a criminal trial. "Your night school credits are from a non-Ivy institution," Ava said, her voice sounding like a gavel strike. "At Blackwood and Finch, we usually don't even look at candidates who haven't walked the halls of Oxford or Cambridge. You're asking for an exception based on... what exactly?" Theodore didn't flinch. "I'm asking for an exception based on the fact that I've spent the last 4 years building foundations during the day and learning how to protect them at night. I don't just know the law, Partner Thorne. I know what it looks like when the law fails the people who can't afford it." Ava leaned forward, the silk of her charcoal suit whispering against the leather of her chair. The scent of her expensive, sharp perfume, white tea and iron, clashed with the faint, honest smell of cedar that clung to him. "Let's test that," she said. "The 2024 revisions to the tax code regarding distressed assets. Specifically, the interplay between Section 42 and the clawback provisions. If a family estate is frozen under a federal investigation, can the junior creditors leapfrog the sovereign liens? You have 60 seconds. Theodore didn't hesitate. He spoke with the cadence of someone who had recited these statutes to himself while hauling timber. He dissected the law with a surgical, brutal efficiency that left no room for doubt. He finished at exactly 58 seconds. Ava felt a traitorous spark of pride in her chest. She suppressed it instantly. She reached for her silver locket, her thumb brushing the cool metal, a gesture Theodore watched with a narrowing of his eyes. "You're hired," she said, shutting his folder. "But don't think for a second this is a homecoming, Theodore. You will be a floating junior. You will have no office. You will work in the document archives, the basement, until you have proven to every partner in this firm that you aren't just a shadow of a disgraced name." "I understand," Theodore said. "And one more thing," Ava added, her voice dropping an octave. "If I see a single trace of the boy I knew 5 years ago, the one who thought the world owed him a seat at the table, you will be out of this building before the ink on your contract is dry. Am I clear?" Theodore stood up. He walked toward her desk, stopping just inches from the edge. For a moment, the professional distance vanished. He looked at her, not as a supplicant, but as a man who had seen the same darkness she had. "The boy you knew died the day they handcuffed his father, Ava," he said softly. "The man standing here just wants to work." The following weeks were a study in restraint. Ava intentionally assigned Theodore the most grueling, soul-crushing tasks. She gave him the 3,000-page discovery files for the Dixon bankruptcy. She made him cross-reference thousands of land titles in the damp, windowless basement of the firm's secondary archive. She expected him to complain. She expected the sterling pride to flare up and burn his resolve. Instead, he was a machine. Every morning at 6 a.m., Ava would arrive to find a summary of the previous night's work sitting on her desk. It was never late, it was never flawed, and most importantly, it was never signed Sterling. He simply signed it T. One rainy Tuesday, deep into the night, Ava couldn't sleep. The pressure of an upcoming class action suit was weighing on her, a case involving a developer, Vanguard Group, that was trying to bulldoze a low-income housing district she recognized all too well. It was the district right next to the trailer park where she grew up. She headed down to the archives to find a specific file. The elevator chimed as it reached the basement, the doors opening to a familiar sight. Rows of gray metal shelves and the hum of a flickering fluorescent light. Theodore was there. He had moved 2 desks together to create a workspace. He was surrounded by towers of paper, a single desk lamp illuminating his face. He had his sleeves rolled up, revealing the corded muscle of his forearms, and he was rubbing his eyes with an exhaustion so profound it made Ava's heart ache. Beside him sat a familiar object, a plastic container. Inside was a simple sandwich, white bread, ham, and a single leaf of lettuce. The reversal was complete. The image hit Ava like a physical blow to the stomach. She stood in the shadows, her hand gripping the cold metal of the elevator door, watching the man she had once hated eat the very meal he had mocked her for. He didn't see her. He took a bite, then immediately turned back to a ledger, his pen scratching against the paper. He wasn't just working. He was atoning. Ava stepped out of the shadows. The sound of her heels on the concrete floor made Theodore snap his head up. He scrambled to stand, nearly knocking over his coffee, a cheap lukewarm cup from the break room. "Partner Thorne," he said, his voice husky from disuse. "I didn't expect you down here." "I needed the Vanguard file," she said, her voice less sharp than usual. She walked over to his desk, her eyes lingering on the plastic container. "You're still here. It's 2 a.m. "The research into the Vanguard zoning wouldn't wait," he said, gesturing to the papers. "I found a discrepancy. They're claiming the land is blighted to bypass the residency protections. But I found the original soil reports from 30 years ago. The land isn't blighted, it's rich. They're lying to the city to save on the relocation costs." Ava looked at the report he had highlighted. It was the needle in the haystack, the one piece of evidence that could save the neighborhood. "Why didn't you put this in the morning briefing?" she asked. "I wanted to be sure," Theodore said. He looked at her, and the distance between them seemed to shrink in the dim light. "I know that neighborhood means something to you, Ava. I saw the map on your desk. I remembered where the bus used to drop you off." Ava felt a lump form in her throat. You remembered that? I remember everything, he whispered. The air between them became thick, electrified by the same static that had once sparked in the Sterling library. Theodore took a step toward her. He didn't reach for her, but the intention was there, a gravity that pulled them toward each other. Ava, he said, using her name for the first time in weeks. I didn't come back to Blackwood and Finch for the law. I came back because you were the only person who ever told me the truth about myself. You were the only thing in my life that wasn't a lie. Ava looked down at his hands, the scars, the calluses. She looked at the sandwich on the table. She thought of her own journey, the years of cold offices and lonely victories. Theodore, she said, her voice trembling. You don't have to do this. You don't have to live in the basement to prove yourself to me. Yes, I do, he said, his gaze unwavering. Because I don't want you to hire me because you feel sorry for me. And I don't want you to love me because I'm a Sterling. I want you to see me. He reached out, his fingers finally grazing the sleeve of her silk blazer. It was a light, tentative touch, but it felt like a brand. Ava didn't pull away. She stood there, a powerful woman in a crystal tower, feeling like the scholarship girl again. Vulnerable, seen, and for the first time in 5 years, not alone. The silence was broken by the sharp, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of someone approaching from the hallway. Ava jumped back, her professional mask slamming back into place just as Riley, her assistant, appeared at the door. Miss Thorne? I'm sorry to interrupt, but the Vanguard group just filed an emergency injunction. They're moving the bulldozers in at dawn. We have 4 hours to stop them. Ava turned to Theodore. The moment of vulnerability was gone, replaced by the fire of the fight. Get the soil reports. Get the 1892 grants we found 5 years ago. We're going to court. Theodore nodded, his face hardening into the mask of a lawyer who had nothing left to lose. I'll have the brief ready in 20 minutes. As they raced toward the elevator, Ava caught her reflection in the glass. She looked at Theodore, standing beside her, his shoulders square and his eyes fixed on the task ahead. She realized then that the chasm wasn't gone. It had simply been filled. Not with money or names, but with the grit of two people who had both learned that the only thing worth owning is the strength to stand back up. But as the elevator climbed, Ava felt a cold knot of dread. Vanguard Group wasn't just any developer. Their lead counsel was a name she hadn't seen in years, Sophia, the girl from the break room. The past wasn't just coming back, it was coming for revenge. The pre-dawn light over London was a bruised purple, the kind of cold, unforgiving hue that made the glass buildings look like jagged shards of ice. Ava sat in the back of the firm's black sedan, the leather seat cool beneath her. Beside her, Theodore was hunched over a tablet, the blue light reflecting in the sharp angles of his face. He hadn't slept. A smudge of ink darkened his thumb, and his tie, the off-the-rack one he'd bought with 3 weeks' wages, was slightly askew. He looked like a man going to war. The injunction is scheduled for 8 p.m., Ava said, her voice sounding brittle in the quiet car. She reached for her locket, her fingers tracing the etched floral pattern. If the judge signs it, the bulldozers start at 9 a.m. By noon, the community center where I learned to read will be a pile of bricks. Theodore looked up from the screen. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the seat. This time, he didn't pull back. He let his pinky finger hook against hers, a small grounding anchor of warmth. They think they're fighting a neighborhood, Ava, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. They don't realize they're fighting the two people who know exactly how they hide their skeletons. I spent 20 years watching people like the Vanguard Board eat lunch. I know how they swallow when they're lying. The royal courts of justice felt like a cathedral of judgment. The high-vaulted ceilings and the smell of floor wax and old wood usually made Ava feel powerful, but today, they felt suffocating. As they approached courtroom 4, a woman was standing by the double oak doors. She was draped in a cream cashmere coat that probably cost more than Theodore's annual salary. Her hair was a perfect honeyed blonde, and her smile was as sharp as a razor blade. Sophia. Well, well, Sophia purred, her eyes skating over Ava before landing on Theodore with a look of predatory amusement. I heard a rumor that Blackwood and Finch had a new special projects clerk, but I didn't realize they'd started a rehabilitation program for fallen princes. Theodore didn't flinch. He stood half a step behind Ava, his posture professional, his face a mask of iron. It's good to see you, Sophia. I see you're still representing the highest bidder, regardless of the ethics. Sophia laughed, a tinkling, hollow sound. She stepped closer to him, the scent of her expensive floral perfume invading their space. And I see you're still playing the hero. Tell me, Teddy, does the night shift security guard look suit you? Or do you miss having someone to polish your shoes? He doesn't miss anything you'd understand, Sophia, Ava interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. We're here for the 8 a.m. hearing. Unless you're here to sign a voluntary stay of demolition, move aside. Sophia's smile vanished. She leaned in toward Ava, her voice a poisonous whisper. You think you've won because you have a corner office? You're still the girl with the ham sandwich, Ava. And today I'm going to remind the court that your star witness is the son of a federal convict. Let's see how your merit holds up when I drag the Sterling name through the mud again. The courtroom was nearly empty, save for a few weary journalists and the Vanguard representatives sitting like vultures in the front row. Judge Miller, a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite, peered over his spectacles as Ava stood. Your Honor, Ava began, her voice echoing in the chamber. The Vanguard Group is seeking to exercise a blight clause to displace 300 residents. They claim the land is chemically unviable for residential life. We are here to prove that this claim is not only fraudulent, but a deliberate concealment of historical property rights. For the next hour, it was a bloodbath. Sophia was brilliant, ruthless, and condescending. She presented doctored soil reports with a flourish, patronizing Ava at every turn. Then she turned her sights on Theodore. Your Honor, Sophia said, turning toward the gallery where Theodore sat with the files. The defense relies heavily on research conducted by Mr. Theodore, a man who, until recently, was known as Theodore Sterling. The son of Marcus Sterling, currently serving 12 years for financial fraud. One has to wonder if the merit of this research is as tainted as the name associated with it. A murmur went through the room. Theodore sat perfectly still. He didn't look down. He didn't hide his hands. He looked directly at the judge. Ava felt a surge of cold fury. She didn't look at the judge, she looked at Theodore. She saw the man who had worked in the basement, the man who had eaten the ham sandwich, the man who had sacrificed his pride to learn the truth. Your Honor, Ava said, her voice vibrating with a power that silenced the room. The name on the research is irrelevant. The work stands on its own. And if Miss Sophia is so interested in the Sterling legacy, perhaps she'd like to see the one thing Marcus Sterling missed. She gestured to Theodore. He stood up, his movements fluid and certain. He walked to the front of the court and handed Ava a yellowed, fragile piece of parchment, the 1892 land grant. This, Ava said, holding the document up like a holy relic, is the sovereign grant for the parish of St. Jude's, the heart of the affected district. It was never industrial. It was never blighted. It was granted as a perpetual agricultural trust. Under the 1925 Land Act, the same act Theodore and I studied 5 years ago, this trust cannot be dissolved by a private developer. The land doesn't belong to the city, and it certainly doesn't belong to Vanguard. It belongs to the residents in perpetuity. Theodore stepped forward, his voice joining hers. We cross-referenced the soil reports Vanguard provided with the original drainage maps from the 1890s, the chemical runoff they cited. It's actually a natural mineral spring that was diverted in the 1970s. Vanguard didn't find blight, Your Honor. They found an excuse. Sophia's face went from pale to ashen. She scrambled through her notes, her poise shattering. This is a technicality, a century-old piece of paper. It's the law, Sophia, Theodore said, his voice calm and devastating. Something you used to know before you started billing by the hour for lies. Judge Miller leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the 1892 grant. The silence in the room was absolute. Ava could hear the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall, each second a heartbeat in the life of her old neighborhood. "Injunction denied," the judge snapped, the gavel strike sounding like a thunderclap. "I am referring the Vanguard Group to the Attorney General for an investigation into evidentiary fraud. And, Miss Sophia, I suggest you find a very good lawyer of your own." The chaos that followed was a blur. Vanguard representatives fled the room. Journalists swarmed. But Ava and Theodore were in a vacuum. They stood in the center of the courtroom, the oak pews and high windows framing them like a portrait. Theodore looked at his hands, the hands that had found the 1892 grant in a dusty basement. He looked at Ava. "We did it," he whispered. "No," Ava said, stepping closer until the scent of cedar and soap overwhelmed the smell of the courtroom. "You did it. You found the spring, Theodore. You found the heart of the case." "I found it because I wanted to save the place where you became you," he said. He reached out, his hand finally moving past the sleeve of her jacket. He cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing over the skin just below her eye. It was a soft, reverent touch, the touch of a man who had finally earned the right to be there. Ava didn't pull away. She leaned into his palm, closing her eyes for a brief, beautiful second. The Iron Scholar and the Fallen Star were gone. There were only two people who had clawed their way out of their respective darknesses to find each other in the light. "Theodore," she murmured, her breath hitching. "I don't care about the firm, Ava," he said, his forehead resting against hers. "I don't care about the names or the suits. I just want to be the man who stands beside you, whether it's in a basement or a boardroom." Ava opened her eyes, the hazel flecks bright with unshed tears. She reached up, her hand covering his. "You already are that man." The doors of the courtroom swung open, and the sunlight of a clear London morning flooded the room, casting long golden streaks across the floor. They walked out together, shoulder to shoulder, leaving the ghosts of Sterling and Associates behind. But as they reached the sidewalk, where the neighborhood residents were already gathered, cheering and crying, Ava felt a final lingering shadow. Theodore's father. A letter had arrived at the office that morning, postmarked from the federal prison. Theodore hadn't opened it yet, but as they stood in the sun, Ava saw the corner of the envelope peeking out of his pocket. The forge had tempered them, but the final test of forgiveness was still to come. The air in courtroom 4 was stagnant, heavy with the scent of old wood and the electric hum of a high-stakes finale. Sophia stood at the mahogany lectern, her cream cashmere coat draped over the bench like a royal mantle. She projected an aura of absolute, inherited certainty. To her, this wasn't a battle of law. It was a cleanup operation. She looked at Ava with a flicker of the same social contempt she had displayed years ago in the break room, the look of someone who believed that grit could never overcome gold. "Your Honor," Sophia began, her voice a polished instrument of condescension. "While the defense's nostalgic attachment to 19th century soil reports is charming, it does not supersede the modern economic necessity of urban revitalization. The Vanguard Group has followed every protocol. This community is a liability, not a legacy." She smiled then, a sharp, triumphant curve of the lips. She underestimated Ava Thorne one last time. Ava didn't stand up with a poetic plea. She stood up with a black leather binder. "Revitalization requires honesty, Miss Sophia," Ava said, her voice dropping into a register of cold, clinical precision. "And the Vanguard Group has practiced neither. My associate Theodore spent 300 hours cross-referencing Vanguard's internal audit trails against the city's environmental database. What we found wasn't just blight. It was a manufacture of it." Ava flipped open the binder. Vanguard utilized 3 shell companies, Redwood Holdings, Blue Sky Development, and Sterling Vance, to deliberately pressure residents into selling. They artificially inflated their blight reports by suppressing environmental data that showed a natural mineral spring was actually being diverted into the foundations to cause structural instability. They didn't find a blighted neighborhood, they created one. The silence that followed was absolute. The Vanguard board members in the front row began to whisper frantically. Sophia's smile didn't just fade, it curdled. Furthermore, Ava continued, stepping toward the bench, Vanguard violated the same long-standing environmental protection clauses that Marcus Sterling ignored 5 years ago. The history of this firm is written in the fine print of the law, and today, that fine print is speaking back. The final blow came from the documentation. Theodore had organized every email, every wire transfer, and every doctored soil report into a timeline so undeniable it left no room for legal maneuver. Judge Miller spent 10 minutes reviewing the files. The only sound was the turning of pages, a sound that to Sophia must have felt like a hammer on her reputation. Injunction denied, the judge said, his voice a final, heavy gavel strike. Definitively, I find the Vanguard Group in contempt of environmental disclosure laws. There will be no postponement and there will be no negotiation. The residents of St. Jude's are protected by a binding court order, effective immediately. Sophia didn't scream. She didn't argue. She simply sat down, her face a mask of pale, frozen realization. The Iron Scholar and the Fallen Star had just dismantled her world. As she left the courtroom, the journalists ignored her, her aura of invincibility stripped away. She finally understood that in a room of logic, social status is a ghost. The aftermath was a quiet, internal victory. Ava didn't pop champagne. She walked out to the courthouse steps and pulled her phone from her pocket. She called her mother first, her voice finally breaking as she told her the neighborhood was safe. Then, she did what she had dreamed of for a decade. She drove back to the park. She stood in the gravel driveway of her youth, the girl with the lantern finally returning as a woman who had saved the ground she stood on. She wasn't a savior from above. She was a daughter who had come home whole. Theodore didn't follow her. He went back to the firm to finalize the filings. When the ruling was officially published that evening, the judge's written opinion explicitly cited a technical argument Theodore had developed regarding the clerical intent of the 1892 grant. For the first time in his life, Theodore's name appeared in a legal record not as a beneficiary or a scandal, but as a merit. He wasn't winning against Ava. He was finally worthy of walking beside her. That night, the lights were off in the Blackwood and Finch offices, save for the soft glow of the moonlight through the floor-to-ceiling glass. Ava was sitting on the edge of her desk, her heels discarded, her eyes fixed on the city lights. The door opened. Theodore walked in, his tie gone, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He stopped a few feet away, the silence between them thick with the weight of the day and the history of 5 years. There was no immediate kiss. There was no grand cinematic declaration of love. There was only the truth. I've spent my whole life proving I deserve to be in rooms like this, Ava said, her voice a soft, tired murmur. She looked at Theodore, her hazel eyes searching his. If I stay with you, Theodore, it won't be to fix anyone. I'm done being a caretaker for broken things. Theodore looked at his hands, the scarred, calloused hands that had spent the night in the archives. He looked back at her, his face stripped of every lie he had ever told. I don't want to be fixed, Ava, he said. I spent 5 years fixing myself. I just don't want to lie about who I am ever again, to you or to myself. They stood on equal footing, not a billionaire's son and a scholarship girl, but two people who had both looked at the bottom of the world and decided to climb. Then we start here, Ava said. They didn't promise eternity that night. They didn't speak of weddings or forever. They simply chose to try, built on a foundation of reality rather than fantasy. The happy ending was not a fairy tale. It was a construction. 1 year later, the Sterling Estate, now the Thorne Sterling Foundation, opened its doors for its first gala. It was a beautiful, crisp evening. The manor had been transformed into a center for legal education and community advocacy. The garden was filled with white roses and wild lavender. Ava stood in the center of the terrace, a vision of earned grace in an ivory gown that flowed like silk. She looked at the crowd, a mix of high court judges and rural families. She saw her father laughing with a senior partner, and her mother sitting in a sun-drenched chair, safe and honored. Theodore approached her, his hand sliding into hers. He looked striking in his tuxedo, a man who had finally earned the suit he wore. The final report came in, Theodore whispered. The scholarship fund is fully endowed. The first 20 students start in September. Ava squeezed his hand. All the problems that had once seemed like mountains were now just parts of the landscape. The debt was gone. The scandal was a footnote. Their love was no longer a secret or a struggle. It was a legacy. As the music began, a soft, swelling melody that carried over the hills, Theodore led her to the center of the dance floor. They were a beautiful couple, radiant with the glow of a peace they had fought for. "You ready for the next chapter, partner Thorn?" Theodore asked, a playful, loving spark in his gray eyes. "As long as you're the one writing it with me," she replied. They danced under the stars, the Iron Scholar, and the man who had reclaimed his soul. The ending was happy, the resolution was deep, and for the first time in their lives, the silence was no longer heavy. It was full. If this story touched you, leave a comment. I read every single one. Thank you for watching, and until the next story.